And we've got four very esteemed people involved in economics here to try and help our way through the minefield of economics and the crisis and what it's all about. So let me quickly introduce them. On my left is Diane Coyle. She runs the Enlightenment Economics, and she's been writing several books, loads of books on economics for ages. She knows loads of stuff about economics, and she's going to be trying to convince us all that there is a future for economics. It's very important and it does its job extremely well, although there are things that could be better. On my far left is Bridget Roswell, she works for Voltaire Partners. So she's, again, extremely knowledgeable about policy, about finance, about economics, about things that are very, very, very important and sophisticated and difficult. And I might say at this point that it's very intimidating sitting here with four people with brains the size of a planet. And not only that, three of them are women. And I think that's actually a fantastic thing, actually. I think today, all days, 2012, it's about time that we have far more women experts pushed to the front, and conferences like these, where we have experts who are women, actually, is a fantastic thing. I think that's something that the organisers should be congratulated on, especially this panel. Now, Professor Carol Poppert, she's a woman as well, and she's on She is involved in public policy. She's done a lot on the national health, looking at competitive stuff with the national health. She'll be able to tell us all about that if you ask. And again, well worth listening to what she's going to say. And then, of course, we've got the long guy, Aditya Chakrabarti, who works for The Guardian. He is on my right, but he's probably on the left. He's got some questions about economics and the role of it. He will probably be perhaps a bit more sceptical about economics than the three previous people, but not necessarily in any kind of predictable way. So it's going to be interesting, and I think it's going to be down to you to interrogate them and find out what's going on. Just to give you a little bit of background about myself, not that I'm at all interesting in terms of economics, but 3ammagazine.com, that's it, 3ammagazine.com. I'd like a lot of hits tonight just to see whether you've actually been looking at it. And we're not an economics forum, we just do. In fact, we claim to be the oldest literary blog in the world, but there are others that claim that as well. So, but we are interested in this kind of thing. We're interested in ideas, and we're interested in challenge, and we're interested in being a little left field. So it's interesting for me to find myself here in this very esteemed company. There is a bookstall, and there are books there by people that have been in this festival throughout the weekend and here as well this evening. So please do visit that before you go home and buy lots of books. Okay, so what are the issues? The issues are, obviously, we've got a crisis. It seems to be one of economics and therefore politics. The Queen herself was the woman perhaps who put it on the agenda when she said to I think it was the London School of Economics, when she asked, why didn't any of you economic people, geniuses, see this coming? And that's a fairly decent question, and I think it gives a kind of context to what we're doing. So one of the issues is going to be about, should we expect economics to be able to predict things? Is it a kind of science where we ought to be able to, once we get it right, we should be able to know what's going to happen? Or is it more like history, where there's a lot more kind of, there are reasons why things happen, but it's much more difficult to kind of predict because it's a humanities, it's a human thing. So is it like physics or is it like history? That's one of the questions. I guess another issue is who owns economics? Who owns the economists? And I think this is an issue that's come up when you look at, say, the idea of bioethics, where a lot of controversy at the moment in the bioethics, where a lot of the big companies have employed experts in order to defend whatever policies they're putting out. And I think that's been a question for economists as well. If you've got right-wing politics, does that affect the economic judgments that you make? If you've got left-wing politics, is there such a thing as left-wing and right-wing politics? And if, in terms of economics, and if there is, then how do we negotiate that? So I think, obviously, people are in trouble at the moment. Worldwide, we've got an economic crisis, and it's very, very serious. And it's one of those questions now that I don't think any of us can take lightly. It's very, very serious. It involves finances, it involves politics, and it involves two different kinds of economics, at least, macro and micro. And if you're like me, you need a little bit of clarification on the difference, we're going to get that. Dan is going to start and give it, this is how we're going to organise it. I'm going to have 10 minutes from each speaker. Diane's going to give us a kind of an overview and her own position on this. Then we're going to go to Bridget, who's going to focus mainly on the macro issues, but there's going to be other things that she's going to be keen to say as well. Then Carol's going to talk more about the micro issues, but probably might be picking up other things that she's heard and is thinking of. And then Aditya's going to come in at the end with his own perspective on the situation. After that, I think we'll open the floor straight away to questions. I'll take, say, 3 questions at a time, and then we'll get the panel to answer the questions, and we'll go on until the bell rings and the session's over. So, straight away, without any further ado from me, Diane Coyle, do you want to explain what this crisis is and how you think about it?
Before I do, I want to say thank you to all of you. I didn't expect so many people at 4:30 on a wet Saturday to be interested in the state of economics, so thank you. I want to tell you that the motto of 3am magazine is, whatever it is, we're against it, which tells you all you need to know about them. Well worth a look at the website, and Richard's philosophy interviews in particular. This all starts really with the financial crisis, which you might have noticed. During 2008, I've always been an avid reader of the Financial Times, and I noticed the stories they were printing about the London interbank offer rate, which has been more in the news lately than it was then. But I noticed that this rate was going up and up, and it tells you how much banks will charge in interest to borrow each other's money overnight, so just for a few hours. And I looked at how high it was, and I thought, the banks don't trust each other with their own money, in which case I don't trust them with my money either. And I went to the cash machine the next day, and I took out as much as it would give me, and I did that for about a week, because I thought there was a very real possibility that you wouldn't be able to get cash out, you wouldn't be able to go to the supermarket and pay for your groceries, or they wouldn't be able to buy things from their suppliers, and the whole economy could grind to a halt. And it turned out that this actually came very close to happening in the autumn of 2008. Now, for me, it's great because I stashed 500 quid in the books in my bookshelves, and I've found quite a lot of it, but there's still a bit I haven't found. So one day I'll take down a book and it will come tumbling out. But the crisis was a huge wake-up call for economists and economics, and some of them accept that, and some of them don't. It's quite a divided profession at the moment. Now, you might have heard the old joke about there being 3 kinds of economists, the ones who can add up and the ones who can't. Just think about it for a minute if you need to. Now, there are actually, of course, 2 kinds of economists. There are macroeconomists and microeconomists, and they're different tribes. Microeconomics is about individuals and individual companies taking decisions and making choices about what they're going to do, how are they going to spend their money, where are they going to buy their goods, and so on. And they look at the incentives that they face, how much money do they have, what prices are there. There could be non-financial incentives as well, but it's mainly financial ones that we talk about. And they make rational decisions about what they're going to do. Now, that assumption of rationality has been very strongly challenged, and partly by behavioural psychologists who have pointed out that there are all kinds of situations in which the decisions that people take are actually not very rational. So when we think about financial decisions that stretch many years ahead and we're very uncertain about what the outcomes will be, actually we're not completely rational. We have certain characteristics. We are averse to losing money, even if the rational thing to do would be to accept that you've lost a bit of money and move on from there, not crying over spilt milk. And so there's this whole field of behavioural economics, using these insights from psychology about the funny little quirks that we have in taking decisions. And that's being woven in to microeconomics with great interest. And any microeconomist is actually really interested in what new scientific evidence there is about how people actually do take decisions. And if it's systematic and you can fit it to data and it seems to explain what happens very well, microeconomists are very happy to use that. It's a little bit complicated because it turns out that actually pigeons and monkeys and rats are very rational in certain circumstances. So if you give them a financial reward in the form of a kind of food that they particularly like, then they'll behave exactly like an economic model says they ought to behave. So it's not straightforward. You can't just say, we're not rational at all, we'll throw all that away and do something new. There are interesting questions about when rats or people are rational and when they're not. And that's a very active research agenda. But basically, microeconomics is in a really healthy state. There's lots of new data to use, lots of computer techniques to use, and maybe Carol will say a little bit more about what microeconomics can tell us. And then there's macroeconomics. It's about the whole economy. When you add everything together, how does the total of consumer spending behave, or the total of investment spending behave? What are the effects of government policy, government spending decisions on the economy as a whole? The crisis is a much bigger problem for macroeconomists because they didn't spot it coming at all. A few did. A few said in general terms, well, there are some unsustainable trends here. But essentially, their framework, their way of thinking about the world, missed the kinds of tensions that were building up that led to the crisis. So they failed to identify a 500-fold increase in leverage, the amount of borrowing that the financial sector was doing over a number of years, and failed to incorporate any possible effects of that in what might happen to the macroeconomy. If you talk to macroeconomists about this, they feel a bit defensive on the whole, and a very distinguished macroeconomist, who I'm not going to name to save his blushes, said to me earlier this week, macroeconomics was absolutely fine. There was no problem with our models. It was the finance guys who got it wrong. And there is an issue about finance. I don't know how much you know about high-frequency trading. This is the trading done by computers on stock markets. And now about 2/3 of all the trades on the American stock markets are done by computers. They're done at intervals of 6 or 9 nanoseconds, millionths of a second. And at that speed, the speed of light is a physical constraint on how much you can trade. So somebody's spending £300 million to put a new fibre optic cable under the Atlantic so the signals from London to New York can get there, I think it's 6 nanoseconds faster than they do at present, and there's a profit in that. Somebody else has dug a tunnel through the Allegheny Mountains in northern Pennsylvania so that the signals from Chicago to New York can get there 9 nanoseconds faster than they were doing. And then when they get to the building where the NASDAQ has its computer servers, there would be an advantage in being a bit closer to the NASDAQ servers if you could. So they equalize the distance by putting in loops of fibre optic cable so that all the signals have the same distance to travel. And this leads to events like what was called the flash crash in May 2011, when there was a plunge in the space of quarter of an hour in the Dow Jones Index, and then it bounced back almost as quickly. And it turns out that if you look at the price data for stock markets at really fine time intervals, they're happening all the time, these crashes. We only spotted the flash crash because it was a slow one, going there and back in less than half an hour. So the potential for this bit of finance to be destabilising is pretty obvious, and regulators are very worried about it. Not so worried that they're going to do the obvious thing and ban high-frequency trading, but nevertheless worried about it. Macroeconomists say this is nothing to do with us, this is finance, it's nothing to do with us. I don't think they understand that for many people, actually, finance is to do with economics, that the intellectual equipment of finance came from economics in the first place and is still running amok like Frankenstein's monster. And actually, macroeconomists didn't put any finance in their models, and that's why they missed this whole business. They've had models of how monetary policy affects the economy as a whole that didn't happen to have any banks in them. And yet they would say that their models are still fine. So I don't want to preempt Bridget too much. I hope I haven't done it too much already.
Okay.
But that's the problem about macro. There's another set of challenges to macroeconomics as well, which is about growth and sustainability, and environmentalists who say we just can't afford, for the sake of the planet, for there to be any more economic growth. And anyway, growth doesn't make us happy, so why bother? Actually, that's factually incorrect. I'm afraid to say, for all those of you who think growth doesn't make us happy, it does actually. It's just, if you mistreat the data, you can make it look as though it doesn't. Let me give you a parallel. It's like saying growth doesn't make us any taller. Actually, growth does make us taller, but just not in the same proportion. Otherwise, we'd all be 20 feet tall now. So you're trying to compare two different statistical series, and you've got to do the comparison properly. But anyway, there is a challenge to the way economists think that comes from the environmental movement and the questions of sustainability. It's a challenge really to the idea that economists have, and that's been captured in public policy for so many decades, that efficiency is the overridingly important value. And I think people are now saying, in a way that hasn't been us since 1989 with the collapse of communism, is that right actually, or are there other values that matter as much? And should we stop economics having this kind of automatic override for the sake of efficiency? So I'm going to stop there. I've set out some things that I think are really good about economics and some questions that I think we have to answer. And I think the subject will become much healthier if we economists engage with those questions and have that discussion. So one of the reasons why I wanted there to be a Festival of Economics in the first place, so that we could have a wider discussion than just amongst ourselves. But there are economists who think actually economics is just fine, and anybody else who's challenging them is kind of silly and we'll get over it soon. So I'm going to stop there.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, the second speaker then is Bridget, and she's going to talk about the macro position, but you're also going to talk about other things as well.
I'll try and stick to the more macro piece of this, but I think one of the ways in which to do that is actually to reflect on what we mean by macro and what we mean by the economy, almost, if you like. And I suppose most of my career has been spent on the borderline between the macroeconomy and the microeconomy, and indeed how policy works in all of those contexts. That's really what I want to talk about. And I'm going to do that by addressing two of the questions that Richard started us off on. Is economics more like physics or more like history? And does politics make a difference to the kind of economics that you do? So let's start with the physics bit. Now, of course, one of the things that keeps the politics out of physics is that it's not really about management. Physics is about explaining, and when you know that you can predict, you know you've also got a good explanation. So you're using your data to you're setting up hypotheses. You're using the data to test those hypotheses. If the testing of those hypotheses leads to good predictions, you're pretty sure you're on the right track. You might turn out later to be on the wrong track, incidentally, and then the subject continually moves on, but it moves on kind of one brick at a time. So there are established propositions which everybody agrees with in physics, at least in Newtonian physics. There are no such propositions in economics. There might just about be a proposition that says we all agree that incentives matter. We all agree that somehow if you make something more expensive, you will respond to that. You might actually buy more, you might buy less, incidentally, depending on how you think about this good. But nonetheless, these incentives matter. But there aren't very many more propositions that actually all economists agree on, and that's actually because we have yet to be able to build those kinds of predictable models of how the economy works. whether that's at the basis. We've got some places, as Diane was explaining, in individual markets where individuals are trading and buying and selling things. But certainly when you come up to the economy as a whole, we cannot explain how new things happen. We don't have a good theory of innovation, and that's one of the reasons why engineers get fed up with this, because most of what they're trying to do is new stuff, and indeed new stuff drives most of what happens in an economy: new products, new ideas, new services, an iPad, an iPhone, all of these things that we're all carrying on. Everybody was tweeting like mad earlier. That's new. We have no explanation for those things. We don't have good, reliable data. In the early 80s, I worked in the CBI, it's Confederation of British Industry, and I was commenting there for all the time on new statistics as they came out. And one of the things I learnt doing that job is that not to believe them, because they would probably be revised. I got very fed up once because a new number for investment came out. So I said, I don't really believe this number, it's going to get changed. And then a month later, it came out again and it hadn't been changed. It's going to be changed. And this went on for 3 or 4 months, and I kept saying, it's going to be changed. Then I sort of lost my nerve and stopped saying it was going to be changed. And lo and behold, the following month, they, after I'd stopped making this prediction, they came back and said, actually, we were wrong. So we don't have the kind of data that physicists can use. And if you don't have the kind of data, you can't test the sorts of hypotheses at an aggregate level that physicists can test. So we may try to be like physicists, we may try to do this, and it's a good thing to try. I'm not saying it isn't. So that generally to apply a scientific method is a good thing to do, but you've got to know what the data is, you've got to have good enough data, and you've got to have the ability to test that over a long enough period. So the other problem is that actually the sorts of data that we've got and the sort of system that we're trying to model, A, it keeps changing, and B, it hasn't been around very long. If you think of economics as the study essentially of capitalist systems, that's a couple of 100 years. And most of the data that we've got really doesn't go back much before the First World War without having to do an awful lot of sort of management and estimation of the data. So again, very difficult to make those tests. And if time, space, the feedbacks, because this is a human system after all, so people actually respond to the data and they respond to what they learn, and they make decisions on the basis of what they're learning, all of that means that it's extremely difficult to create that predictability, some explanation, which then says you can test that amount of predictability. And of course it gets worse if you'll then say, I'm only going to look at part of the system. And that's really why I think Diane's stuff about if you're just going to look at the things that I've measured easily, so I've decided I can measure the economy using incomes, consumption, government spending, imports, exports, and that's all I need. I've got a sort of an accounting framework and I'll measure that. And you forget then about all the asset stuff and all the finance, which is really about the borrowing and the lending and how that comes back to assets. In some of the earlier discussions this afternoon, people were talking a lot about infrastructure and the need to generate infrastructure. And why that's important in the real economy, because of course that makes it possible to change the way the economy works. So again, if you haven't got a good theory of how all that happens, and you haven't been able to test it on long-term data, because infrastructure works over the long term, after all, many of us use the trains between London and Bristol. Bristol's the integration between London and Bristol has been a quite strong driver, both of the port here in the 17th, 18th centuries, and then the relationships up and down that train line, put in by Brunel in the 1860s. And it's it's a very well built line, so it's been late to get redone. Actually, I'm also on I'm on the board of Network Rail, so we're working on the electrification. Yeah, so that's quite brave of me. You can come and talk to me later. So we're working on the electrification of that line. It's late because that's such a well-engineered line, because he knew what he was doing, that guy. But we're still reaping the benefits of that. So these are long-term payoffs to long-term investments. And therefore you need long-term data in order to understand that. So if you haven't got any of that, you're not going to have a very good explanation, and you shouldn't be therefore too arrogant about the way that you think that you can explain how the economy grows and how it changes. So arrogance, I would say, is one of the besetting sins of economists. They believe that they can do all this stuff well and that they can both explain and predict. So they think they're like physicists when actually they haven't really got the models or the data which enables them to do that. And moreover, they think they're like Newtonian physicists. So they're more arrogant even than most physicists would be these days, because most physicists know that there's an awful lot of uncertainty out there. Particularly when you get into the detail, quantum physics and so on is full of uncertainty. Whereas there's still a tendency in the policy world, and I think this applies actually to microeconomics as much as to macroeconomics, to believe that you can pull this lever and that will happen. So it's an engineering, it's a Newtonian view of how things happen. And whenever you pull this lever, the same thing will happen. So you can get predictability into that policy development. That's true, for example, that's why we have such a complicated tax system. A lot of that is economists' fault, in that they think, you change a little tax here, and everybody will notice this little change in tax, because after all, marginal changes is what people will really notice, and we'll change our behaviour, and somehow everything will end up in the best of all possible worlds, because we've tweaked the way that all of you guys out there will notice this stuff. In fact, probably you never even noticed some of the changes that took place, certainly couldn't pay attention to them, certainly couldn't make that part of your decision-making process. So too much arrogance about what we've understood and the way that people might react to that and the way that they observe what they're reacting to, let alone a definition. I want to challenge Diane actually on this question of rationality. I think that economists simply have a very odd definition of rationality and not one that most of us would actually recognise. It's not irrational to care about other people. It's not irrational to notice what they say and respond to it. It's not irrational to not spend all your life looking for information, but instead to take shortcuts, use rules of thumb and everything. Life is too short to be a rational economic person. You just spend all your time trying to collect data. That's actually not rational. So we've allowed economists to capture this concept of rationality when actually it's much broader than that. So finally, just I've got 30 seconds left, blast. There's so much more I want to say. So I just want to end by talking about the management piece. 10 years, after 10 years of the Monetary Policy Committee, there was a review of whether it had worked or not. And I put by the Treasury Select Committee, and I put a paper into that saying the fan charts and so on, the uncertainty that the bank talked about, that was good. It was a step in the right direction. They were saying they didn't know. That's great. However, they weren't allowing for the range of ignorance they actually had. 10 years of data wasn't enough. The risk of recession was much higher, and they weren't taking on board all these asset questions and banking questions. And I was poo-pooed. Well, of course 10 years of data is enough. We've solved all these problems. There's an end to boom and bust. Well, that was wrong. We got the crisis. We got the crisis that we deserved. But I also think we shouldn't exaggerate the scale of that. Actually, we have, there's been an awful lot of reaction to it, an awful lot of policy being done. And I don't think we should be too depressed about the state of the economy, even if we're depressed about the state of economics. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Bridget. So we've got economics as the management of ignorance. It's all beginning to come together now. So, Carol, take us now into the depths of the micro picture.
Okay, thank you. I'm slightly beginning to feel like a tax species by my panel members, actually. But I wanted to kind of start with just a bit of sort of personal background, because I don't think I started life as an economist, and I think it's taken me quite a long time to be an economist, partly because when I started economics, it was an incredibly dry subject about how people responded to incentives when resources were finite, hence the word, the dismal science. And the kind of economics that we studied was, I think at that time economists did believe that they were physicists, partly helped by the 1960s, in which there had been some very impressive economists who worked with the US government to try and build models of the economy and to try and build models that in fact were part of, if you like, the Cold War. And what we studied when I was at university seemed incredibly about how, and this was within microeconomics, spending time doing incredibly mathematical models about how, if everybody had perfect information and acted rationally, you didn't need any kind of government or government planner, and everything would work out perfectly. It's kind of known as the Arrow de Breu model. And I was always kind of, I came to this and thought, crikey, what is this? But luckily, in my third year in economics, after grinding through masses of this, actually I read an article about sharecropping. Now, sharecropping, for those of you who don't know about it, is a system in which tenant farmers share their output with their landlords. So in a bad year, when it rains, they may actually get very little because they have to give 50% or even 70% of it their landlords. And in good years, similarly. And at some level, this strikes you as a kind of odd kind of arrangement. Why would you want to become, in a sense, poorer in years in which you had a glad harvest? But some economists had actually worked on this and found that, for people who don't have any credit, one of the ways of actually getting into having land is to share that with the landlord, and there are different terms. And I think that kind of opened up my eyes, that economics gave you a way of thinking about that, and indeed that kind of line of thought actually led to a whole pile of work on US slavery, which I think kind of relates to this thing about whether economics is history or physics, and certainly when you're thinking about the economics of slavery, you are in part talking about history. But I think then what happened to economics was that in about 1980, at least, macroeconomics went even more kind of theoretical. And basically when I studied macro, it was like studying physics. But microeconomics began to ask about the role of information. So that we assume that people generally kind of on average kind of take decisions which are in their own interests, and those own interests may include interests of people they care about. But what happens when they don't have full information? And that's what economics and microeconomics spent a lot of time worrying about. And I think it was very, very enlightening. And one of the examples is the used car market. So there's an American economist called Akerlof who kind of thought about this and basically said, what's the problem with a used car market? Why would you never buy a used car unless you were really, really poor? And the problem is that in a used car market, you can't really tell what the quality of that car is. So what happens is that only sellers who have poor cars put them into the used car market. Other people who are Volvo owners or VW owners go on owning those cars forever. So in the end, the used car market only consists of lemons. It essentially collapses. The solution to that is to bring more information about the cars and cars in the car market. And that will restore the market to health. Now, that kind of thinking is actually incredibly useful when you think about things like insurance. And when you move to think about things like, why is there a problem in health insurance markets? And essentially, health insurance markets can have exactly the same problem. The only people who want to buy health insurance are those people who are unobservably sicker than the health insurance industry can observe. And that means that the health insurance industry has to insure themselves against the people who are insuring themselves with them and raise their prices. In the end, you can only buy health insurance, which is very expensive. And in the limit, if you had, for example, AIDS 20 years ago, you wouldn't have been able to buy health insurance at all. Now, all that thought actually comes out of economics and about thinking about what happens when one party has more information than others, either in the case of the used car seller, or in the case of the health insurance buyer and the firm. And I think that led to a fundamental change in a sense in the usefulness of microeconomics. And that was coupled with something else. That was coupled with advances in data collection and advances in data analysis from within economics, and indeed outside economics. So I think that allowed economists to incredibly broaden their field of study, even if they are left with, on average, trying to believe that on average people do the best they can for themselves. And so kind of some examples of the newer things that economists asked what happens to public investments when you change voting rules. So in India, when you change voting rules to allow women in local elections to vote, or you allow untouchables to vote, what economic analysis has shown is that you get more investment in things like wells, because it's women who have to walk to the wells. So that when you give women the vote, you'll get more money devoted to more wells locally. And that's something that perhaps was an insight that political scientists already knew. But because they don't work with large data sets, because they don't look at 400 villages and 400 sets of elections, they don't find these things out as empirical regularities. Obviously, economists are involved in climate change, and I think climate change has many of the features of physics, that there are lots of very difficult problems. But other areas that economists are in are things like the impact of when you should invest in children. Do you get a better return from your public funds if you, for example, put your money towards 15-year-olds or 13-year-olds or even 18-year-olds? And what a group of economists in the States have done is think about child development, which is obviously a field that all sorts of social sciences specialise in. Think about child development as an investment. And they ask the question, given that money is scarce, given that a lot of this money will come from the public purse, when is the optimal time to invest in children? And that's led to the huge growth of studies within economics of child development and of the returns to early child investment. So and that in turn has influenced things like Sure Start, one of Labour policies, aimed at the early Blair government, aimed at improving the lives of children in deprived areas, because a lot of those studies showed that early investments paid off very largely. Again, I'm sure I know child psychologists know this, but child psychologists aren't interested in taking maybe 30 sets of data about which try and look at when is the best time to invest in children. Other areas that microeconomics has contributed to are things like, should we pay doctors pay for performance, or should we pay doctors' salaries? Now, obviously, when you start thinking about incentives, clearly if you're paid a salary, at the margin, there's an interest in doing as little work as possible. If you're paid for performance, then at the margin, there's interest in faking that you've paid for performance. It's interesting that if you compare doctors in the UK, family doctors who until recent, who've always been paid a little bit for performance, but have also had some kind of salary, with doctors in Denmark who've mainly been paid for performance, or at least paid for output, what you found was that doctors in the UK were very keen to essentially give people scripts, give people drugs, or send them to hospital. Doctors in Denmark didn't do that. Why not? Because doctors in the UK, essentially, the faster they could get a patient out the door and give them a script or send them to a hospital, the more time they had to do other things. Doctors in Denmark, on the other hand, wanted to have you in the surgery. Similarly, doctors in Germany are paid for doing certain things that we don't do here, and the rate of various things like caesarean sections or hysterectomies or other things like that are much higher in systems where you pay for that. Now, you may not think that that's rocket science, but it is really important in the design of healthcare, which after all takes about 10% of our GDP, to know under which circumstances do people respond to incentives, and that's essentially what a lot of economists spend a lot of their time doing. There are other more esoteric things that microeconomists do, partly because they're really interested. The other thing that they're really interested in, and that I think is not just their prerogative within social sciences, but it is part of being at the physics end, if you like, of social sciences, is causality. Economists spend quite a lot of time worrying about making sure that their data shows not just associations, but causality, that A causes B. And why is that redesigning public policy, or you're redesigning the school system, or you're asking, is choice in education a good thing or not, you want to be sure that you've got a causal path rather than just an associative path. Because if you've got an associative path, you don't know that if you pull one lever, everything's going to happen. So a lot of what economics tries to do is to work out, if you do pull this lever, what might happen. Now, we also know that what might be happening is bad, and an example is waiting lists. When the government set waiting list targets, first of all, actually a long time ago, about 20 years ago, those waiting list targets went down incredibly. Hospitals seem to be doing really well. But when accountants and management scientists and economists went and looked at this, what they found was that the waiting lists had been really long. Nobody had any incentive to do anything about them because there was no government policy. And what happened when they did have an incentive to do something about them is they removed the dead from the list. Well, that makes your list shorter, but it doesn't really benefit anyone. The dead have already died. So what economists also are very concerned about is, if you like, the unintended consequences of putting in incentives. So it's not that economists believe that everybody responds, super positively to incentives, but that incentives, they believe that incentives have an effect, that if you change something, people's behaviour will change. I finally kind of wanted to address a little bit this kind of hegemony of economics and this view that all economists think of themselves as masters of the universe. It is true that we are increasingly, I think, as economists, wandering around other social sciences territories, and indeed within economic history, the historians' territories, and that we're often accused of incredible imperialism. And I know this because I used to chair a board that gave out a public body that gave out a lot of money for research, and that board was a bit like the Ark. People went 2 by 2 in their disciplines, so I had 2 anthropologists and 2 neuroscientists actually, and 2 psychologists and 2 economists, and they all kind of, the idea was that they sort of stuck to their own, and it was true that particularly sociologists and the political scientists used to feel that economics was trying to usurp their areas. And I think one of the reasons that economists have been successful in a policy space is because there are lots of, we talked about this a bit last night for those of you who were this night, there's lots of economics in government. There's a government economic service. But there isn't a government psychology service or a government sociology service, which actually would be a very useful thing to do, but the departments who would employ psychologists or employ sociologists tend to contract them out. So the DWP, for example, removed all its analytical services and believed that it was better to buy them from the academic or the consultancy sector, whereas Treasury couldn't really dump all its economists, and the Department of Health couldn't really dump all its economists. So I think that means that economics ideas get heard in government more perhaps than on social sciences ideas. But that isn't economists' fault. I think it's basically government's fault for not thinking that other social sciences might have a role as well. So I don't think it's, entirely fair to accuse kind of economists of thinking that they're all masters, or in my case, mistresses of the universe. In fact, nobody ever, does anything I suggest. In fact, I was. This interesting thing about history, I have studied for a long time competition in healthcare markets. And I was interested in Mrs. Thatcher's healthcare reforms. But being an economist, I had to wait for the data to become available because I need 10 years of data to do the kind of studies I was doing. So by the time I got around to studying Mrs. Thatcher's reforms, which were in 1991, it was by then, in 1999. And if you remember, Tony Blair came in 1997 and said, we shan't have competition. It's not a good thing at all. We're going to have cooperation. So in 1999, I was studying the Thatcher administration, and the then chief economist in the Department of Health, who was a wily old bird and very kind of pragmatic, said to me, Carol, why do you always study history? Why couldn't you study something that will be useful for us? Of course, he wasn't to know that in 2005, Tony Blair had a Damascene conversion and decided that he wanted competition in healthcare, at which point Okay, I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. Finally, Aditya is going to come in perhaps from a bit of a left field. He's not quite as, well, I don't know, he's certainly not quite as enamoured of economics perhaps as our last three speakers. Although, as we've heard now, there's not, the mistresses of the universe are not talking with just one voice. There's a lot of complex stuff going on there, which I think it'll be down to you guys to pull apart and pick up on. When your time comes. So hopefully, just a word of warning, we're going to take questions, when Aditya's finished, we'll be taking questions in groups of three. It would be really helpful if you can start formulating your questions and try and make them sharp so we can get in as many as possible and get as many answers as possible, because I think it's quite useful. So if we can not make them too long and focus, that would really help. So as you're sitting there, start formulating what you want to ask so that we can pick you up and use you in about 10 minutes time. But over to Aditya.
Thank you, Richard. When you're number 4 on a 4-person panel, I think you've got one of two choices. You can either stick with your original remarks, or you can try and respond to what's been said ahead of you. And so I think I'll go for this second path, and chop and change what I was originally going to say a bit. It will make what I would say slightly uneven, I think, but do bear with me. In particular, what I want to try and do, I think, is to tie in the crisis in economics that my fellow panelists have been talking about with the economic crisis that we're all living through, and to try and bring out a bit of the politics of this as well. In essence, I think pretty much since Northern Rock fell over, a lot of discourse, whether in economics or in non-economic social sciences, sometimes remind me a bit of these rather lovely lines by Auden. Auden's got a poem where he talks about how even amid world-stopping tragedy, even as Icarus comes crashing out of the sky, the dogs carry on with their doggy lives, and the torturous horse scratches its innocent behind on a tree. And sometimes it seems to me when I read papers or look at what's been published in academic journals or go to academic conferences, it seems like the combined intelligentsia of Britain is scratching its innocent behind on the tree. Having gone through the economic equivalent of an earthquake, they're just wondering what it means for Barrett's share price or something like that. For instance, if you looked at the academic conferences that were held by the main disciplines last year, the political studies conference had one session on the economic crisis and what it meant for politics. Despite the fact that governments across Europe were collapsing, they had one session which was exactly the same number of sessions that they gave to dons who wanted to know how to advance their careers. If you went to the British Sociological Association conference, you found plenty of conferences, plenty of papers given on subjects such as the holistic massage industry from a Foucauldian perspective, but then anything on economics. And actually, if you went to the Royal Economic Society conference a couple of years ago, which I did, and I'm looking at the chap inviting me in the back of the room. So forgive me, Raj. But if you went to that, which I did a couple of years ago, there were a few, as you'd expect, a few sessions on the economic crisis. But there were far more on subjects which you thought, hang on, this is as if 2008, as if Lehman Brothers, as if Northern Rock hadn't happened. People still carry on turning out the same old work that they would have carried on doing. And I really want just to think a bit about why that should be. If you ask economists the Queen's question, why did no one see it coming, you get from the more thoughtful practitioners the kind of response that Diane's given, which is that basically they got a bit too carried away with their models. In words of Paul Krugman, they mistook truth for beauty, and they thought that their models somehow were just better than their reality. And the rather comforting implication of that is actually all they need is a bit more empirical data and preferably a bit more public grant money to go away and make these models somehow better. And I just don't buy that, actually. It's not just that economists weren't very good forecasters. Actually, I find that the most forgivable part of that is that you can't foresee every crisis that comes on. It's that their models didn't even recognise the possibility that this might happen. As Diane says, they had no real function for the banking sector in most models of the macro economy. But it's a bit more than that, because they weren't just analysts and observers. Actually, as to go back to something Carol said, no academic discipline has played as central a role in shaping British or American society as economics, I would say. It's not just the infiltration of economists into government. It's also the way that they have totally dominated the discussion of what an economy is. So much so that other people, whether from sociology or from other disciplines, have now effectively been fenced off. And in the meantime, economists have effectively, with exceptions and using all the caveats about generalising a fair amount, but economists have played a role in cheerleading the kind of economy you're now in. And this is where I think the crisis in economics plays directly into the economic crisis. If you want to look at the phenomenon of share of fat cat pay, how much we should pay people who run companies. One of the great papers which kind of kicked off that kind of revolution of allowing CEOs to be paid whatever they wanted was written by a pair of economists, Michael Jensen and Kevin Murphy, published a paper in 1990 in the Journal of Political Economy, and then a populist version in the Harvard Business Review. And you don't even need to read it, because the title tells you what the argument is. It's CEO incentives. It's not how much you pay, but how. 25 years later on, 30 years later on, we're now dealing with the consequences of that, and get around to the idea that actually it does matter how much you pay people to run companies, and it does matter how they're incentivised. But at the time, that paper probably remains one of the most influential papers in the field of CEO pay. It's one of the most quoted, and yet it's as a codification of bonus culture, it's equivalent to putting a mortarboard on the head of Gordon Gekko. And just to give you an idea of how prevalent the influence of that paper by Jensen Murphy is, an economist from the University of Chicago called Luigi Zingales, early this year, who's not a left-wing economist at all, actually, I would say a right-wing economist, but is very troubled by what's happened to economics. And so he went back and looked at this issue of CEO pay. And as he said quite rightly, you could argue one way or the other. You could say, even these people deserve what they get paid. There is a market for CEOs, and that market will find its correct price. Or you can say, actually, it really does matter, because if you give people really rotten incentives, they behave in a rotten fashion. So you could split it either way. But after looking over 150 academic papers, he found that if you were to argue the Jensen-Murphy line, that is, if you were to say that actually we should give bosses whatever it is they wanted, you were 55% more likely to be quoted, to be published in one of the top academic journals. 55%.
That's not what Jackson Murphy said.
We'll come back to that later. But if you were to give that argument of letting bosses get paid whatever they wanted, you would be 55% more likely to be published in one of the top academic journals. And you can imagine what that then means for people citing you and quoting you and referring to you later on. That's one example. Some of you may have seen the film Inside Job.
Yes.
There you see, I actually found it quite shocking, and I shouldn't be really, but there's a segment in that film where the filmmakers go and talk to top economists. So they talk to Fred Mishkin, who used to be at the US Central Bank, and he says, why did you write this paper about the Icelandic financial system that says how well Iceland was doing just a few years ago? And it's called Stability in Iceland, or something like Financial Stability in Iceland. Turns out in his CV, which he published after Iceland's crash, he's now called it Financial Instability in Iceland. And they asked him why he wrote this paper, and he said, well, you know, he just took it a trust. And at the end, they just bring up a fact that he was paid over $100,000 to write that paper by the Outstanding Chambers of Commerce. Then they go to Glenn Hubbard, who was an advisor to Bush, also an advisor to Mitt Romney in his presidential campaign, and I think he's still now Dean at the Columbia Business School. And they ask him, you know, what's the extent of your interests outside academia? And they find that he's been consulting endlessly to financial firms, private equity firms that were paying far more than he would have got from his from his academic interests. And you could carry on and carry on. So you don't need to go just at people who are Republicans. Larry Summers, who was at Harvard, famous Democrat obviously, still given an open berth to say whatever he wants in the Financial Times, has worked for a number of years on Wall Street. Got paid millions for doing so. I'm not saying that all economists are on the tape, I don't think that. But I do think it pays to be deluded. It pays to put across a certain outcome. And if you just think about what the rewards would be for putting across a certain argument. You know, the publication in top journals, the earned professorships, the invitation consultancy in Wall Street or in City, the obviously book contracts, and so on and so forth. And if you don't think that that might turn a young economist head, then I think to refer you to what Bridget said earlier, which is that incentives matter. Of course they do. And so when economists will say, well, it doesn't really matter how I arrive at my conclusion because it's got a scientific basis, you can test it out. Well, the amount of your career prospects, I imagine, must be a bit of concern of anyone starting out in any discipline. So I imagine these incentives matter. I was talking to a guy who runs something called the Institute for New Economic Thinking, called Rob Johnson. And he used to work on a hedge fund. He used to work on George Soros's hedge fund. So he used to bring a lot of these academic economists to come and talk to him and his colleagues. And he quoted a dictum that was given to him by a leading West Coast economist. And it went like this. If you went and you were agreeable, the kind of message you gave were agreeable to Wall Street, you got to take nice holidays on Lake Como. If you let finance alone, you got a nice vacation in California, which I guess if you're a West Coast academic probably doesn't mean that much to you. If on the other hand you took on the bankers, you ended up driving a second-hand car. It tends to matter. So I think to some extent, we are going through a crisis. It's not one that just ended in 2008. If you look at what Mervyn King's been saying, this in Britain we've got another 5 years of this. If you look at what Angela Merkel says, in the Eurozone we've got another 5 years of this. I think the Institute for Financial Studies Fiscal Studies says that it will take until well into the 2020s for the average family in Britain to be earning what they were in real terms back in 2002. So this is the crisis that's carrying on, and yet the economists, I do not think, are people that we ought to be turning to in the first instance for answers on how to deal with this. The problem I have, I think, is that no other academic discipline, I think, stands ready to go into the frame. If you were to go back to economics, for instance, there are a whole range of people who sometimes get called heterodox economists, which I think just means anything from Greek economics to Keynesian economics, but they're simply banded together because they're non-orthodox. A lot of these heterodox economists no longer work on the economics faculties. So if you would think about one of the leading economists in Britain, one of the most well-known, I guess someone who most of you would have heard of, Arjun Chang. He doesn't teach on the economics faculty of Cambridge. He's a really well-known development economist. He's often brought in by governments around the world to tell them the kind of policies they should be teaching. And yet, he's not allowed to teach his development studies programme as part of the economics faculty at Cambridge. He has to teach as part of the development faculty. So there is what he calls a Talibanisation of economics that's happened, where anyone who's had non-orthodox opinions within economics has been cleared off. And on the other hand, what you have is people from outside economics and social sciences, the sociologists, the political scientists, the anthropologists, who you think might be, at this stage, this might be a moment which we turn to them and say, so what should we be thinking about? How should we characterise this crisis? Well, they've gone through 30 years of effectively being fenced off, not having the credence to talk about economics. To give you an example of that, a few months ago, I went and looked at some of the academic journals. I just went and looked at the mainstream academic journals in sociology. And I went into their databases and I went on a search. And I typed in 3 words: finance, or economy, or markets. And I went through the results of what came back, went through the abstracts, looked through some of the papers. And you get an awful lot, as you might imagine in terms of that journal, you get an awful lot of crap, which is, it doesn't really have everything to say about what I'm looking for. So you get an awful about cultural capital, or about ethnic capital, or so on and so forth. But when it came down to it, when you weeded out all the other stuff, you said, so what in these academic journals had anything to say about finance, anything to say about the crisis whatsoever, from early last decade through to now? You find, in the American Sociological Review, a total of 9 articles. The majority of them written and published after Lehman Brothers fell over. In sociology, which likes to call itself the UK's premier sociological journal, you found a total of 3 articles. And in the British Journal of Sociology, you find 1 article. So what you have is a crisis that we're all going through, where the economists, I think, have been largely discredited, where actually, to use the phrase from Clement Attlee, I think a long period of silence from them would be most welcome. And yet you do not have people from other disciplines, from other areas of intellectual life, who are able, equipped, confident to enter the fray. Yesterday evening, Rachel Lomax, formerly of Bank of England, said, we're into this crisis, it's much worse than the 70s. Where's the revolutionary thinking? Well, I think therein lies your answer. You're in a crisis. No one I can see has got the kind of the self-confidence, the depth of study, the willingness to enter into this frame.
Thank you very much. We'll not be asking our economics to stay silent until at least the end of this session, do not worry. Now, what we'd like to do is have as many questions as we can, as I say, and what we'd like to do is take them in kind of 2s and 3s. One of the other things that I think I'd like to also just put on the table is that we have 3, as I said at the beginning, 3 women speakers here. In earlier sessions, it's been noticeable that there's been a gender split in who's been asking questions. Men tend to be asking questions, women wait until the end before they do. So could I encourage you to ask questions, all of you, as opposed to just the enthusiasts. We've got one already, so the lady with your hand up, number 1, the guy at the front there, and the guy who called out, there's number 3. So could we take those 3, first of all, in order, please?
Thank you. I'd like to ask Diane, what would have happened if everyone in Britain who had a bank account understood the information you understood that made you take your money out of the bank that week?
Thank you. Yes, sir. Yes, you. Yes.
I'm here, sorry.
Yes. Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Hi. I suppose Adichie has already covered part of this, but considering the general reluctance of the mainstream to focus on heterodox theories, in fact, the only lecture I've had regarding decision theory and rule of thumbs was organised by the Bristol University School of Engineering. How long do you think it would take for these theories to be discussed by the mainstream? And furthermore, how long do you think it will take before the mainstream education starts covering them?
Thank you. And finally, the gentleman in the heckler.
I think it is fair enough to say that economists, some degree of mea culpa from economists is appropriate. Sorry, I'm an economist. I also think that there was some corruption, and I think the film Inside Job, anybody who's watched that film, it's very difficult to watch that film and not feel that some of those who are being questioned didn't profit from expressing the opinions they expressed, and that to some extent, they were paid to be deluded, as I think you put it.
There is some form of corruption.
Okay, I'm not going to...
So present tense.
Yes, present tense. However, I don't think it helps to say things about a paper, to make comments about an academic paper, which is simply a caricature and actually untrue. The Murphy and Jenks paper just doesn't say what you said it does, and I don't think that's helpful.
I quoted the title.
You quoted the title.
From them, CEO incentives, it's not how much you pay per hour.
Yeah, that wasn't... I'm not quarrelling with the fact that you quoted the title. You also said that you characterised the paper as saying CEOs should be paid whatever they wanted, which is bullshit.
Thank you. Okay, so we've got a comment and 2 questions. So, Dan, do you want to start off, then other panellists can join in or add to your initial responses?
Well, yes, there are 2 kinds of crises, I suppose. There are the self-fulfilling ones and the self-averting ones. And if everybody had done the same thing and gone to get the cash out, it would have been a self-fulfilling one, a sort of bank run on a big scale. So I'm very glad that not everybody did it.
Does anyone else want to add to that? Okay. And the second question.
Maybe Carol, as an academic.
I wanted to kind of think about the first one, actually, because one of the issues is that what is rational for one person to do, Diane hoarding her £50 notes, £500 notes, is not rational for everyone to do. Hence, you move from somebody being a prudent housewife to having a major bank run and being in Germany in 1929. And that's one of the things that I think economics really grapples with, as do other social sciences. That economics is, I think, one of the things I would criticise economics for, is that we actually do quite well with the individual. We don't do very well with the collective. We don't do very well with society. And it's much harder for social sciences to say things definitively about societies, because you can't have nice controlled behavioural experiments, with the exception of kind of East and West Germany that we heard about last night. In general, when you look at whole behaviours of societies, you can really only look at the behaviours of individuals. But I think that's not necessarily a kind of intellectual fault of economics. It's partly that it's not like medicine, where you can expose some people to a placebo and expose other people to a treatment and wait and see what happens. You don't really want everyone to become North Korea, because you either can't do it and you probably wouldn't want to do it. So I think that's one of the just general problems that economics has, that we can't say very much about collectives.
In that case, can I... Oh,
Yeah.
Bridget.
I want to tackle that in a slightly different way, which is how long does it take people to change their positions? And there is research on this which suggests it's death by death, or retirement by retirement, to put it more gently. In other words, people have invested their careers in a particular way of looking at the world, actually don't change it. Keynes said, we're all the slaves of defunct economists. So the way that it works in the university and the way that it works in policy, I think, is also very important. So some of the things that Carol's been talking about, both things we do well and things we do badly, are being able to think about it from, if you like, the standpoint of somebody with a tenured position in a university where you can afford to stand back. Many of the things that economists do in public policy, or in where they are being deluded, if you like, are immediate, trying to answer a policy question where you're effectively being put on the spot for an answer. And I wanted to use that as a way into this question about corruption, if you like. I mean, I'm a consultant, right? People come along and they ask me to do a study about something. If I know that they want an answer which I think is wrong, I will reject that piece of work. Somebody else will do it. But there's some of that which is actually about having different people on different sides of the argument. So there's somebody who's going to take one position and there's somebody going to take another position. That's not necessarily wrong, because in many cases where you're thinking about are the costs and the benefits of a particular policy positive or negative, then there are actually more than one way of looking at that. And there's more than one answer that you might come to, depending on the value that you're putting on different things. And that actually takes you straight back into the society position. Andrew Sentence said earlier, we can't make a decision about where to put a runway. I've been doing quite a lot of work around aviation, and I think that the arguments that I might come up with, or the estimates of cost, the estimates of impact that I might come up with, are not for, they're for all of us to judge the relative importance of all of those, not just for me to say, oh, there's a cost-benefit analysis, the answer is 3.1, therefore you're going to do whatever this thing is. It's actually, we need a much more informed debate about many of those policy balances. And if we do that, then so long as everybody knows that you've either been paid or not been paid to make a particular form of analysis, it doesn't actually matter, so long as there's somebody standing on both sides of that debate and both sides of where the sorts of costs and the sorts of benefits of a particular policy might come. And I think that that's absolutely essential, in fact, for a healthy debate, not something that should somehow be banned.
Yeah. So I'll just briefly come back, and then I think we would stay and discuss afterwards, or have a fight, or I did actually go back and look at that Jensen Murphy before I wrote about it just a few months ago. And as I recall, you may well have the advantage of me because my memory may be fault, but as I recall, it says that the way to get around the principal agent problem is to give managers a stake in a company by giving shares. This then enables them, the way that the purpose for which that paper was then used, was then to enable them to argue that yes, they can get X amount of money in share options. Right?
Correct. That's what
Right, so then it becomes an argument about, well, you know, I'm entitled to whatever I pay because I've got a stake in this company.
No, it doesn't become that. That's what
No, that's what I'm saying. That's what I'm saying. Then it's the purpose to which it was then pressed. Right?
Let's
Okay, so we'll have a cup of tea or a fire.
See, it's turning into a 3am do. It usually ends up everyone's drunk and fighting at the end.
The interesting question I thought was about what, you know, where do we find the more interesting kind of economics? I think that's a really fascinating question, and I ended up sounding perhaps unduly gloomy at the end of my remarks. If I wanted to point to where you might have signs of hope, first of all, the British Sociological Association's next conference will actually be directly addressing the crisis. So you are starting to get some of the disciplines now starting to shake a leg and starting to think a bit more about finance and economics. And at Sheffield University, there's a political economy research institute that's been set up under Colin Hay. And that looks very promising. But what you would have to say is this is all very early stages stuff. Because inevitably, in the timeline that it takes for people to do stuff, it takes a few years to do the research, to do the thesis, and then to publish it and disseminate it. So you're talking ages and ages before it gets down to the level of undergraduate education. As you say, some of the most interesting stuff, some of the most interesting discussions about the crisis are not happening on economics faculties. There's a group up in Manchester who, if you're interested in looking out for work, it's a group up in Manchester called the Centre for Research into Economic, Social, Cultural Change. I think that's right. It's called CREST for short. And they've done tremendous work on banking and on industrial policy, rail, and so on and so forth. But they are a very weird collage of some economists, some historians, some accountants, some guy who used to work in private equity and is now retired, and so on and so forth. But I think their way of working, is a really interesting one. So they bring together people from lots of disciplines. They publish to a timeline which is not strictly dictated by journals. So they'll do public interest papers, and they'll do all kinds of public engagement as well. And I think part of what irks me sometimes about discussions of crisis is it's an economic crisis that affects everyone in the country, and yet academics often feel the need to talk to themselves about what's going on. And it's one of the reasons why I think this festival is such a great thing, that actually having some level of public engagement and forcing academics to recognise they've got obligations to you and to the public to engage with you, to explain what it is they've been up to, and then to listen to and to take on board concerns from people. I think that's really important.
Thanks a lot. I think we'll take some more questions. We've got 1, and then 2, and then 3.
I'm been very interested in what you've been talking about throughout the 4 sessions. What I'm curious about, because there's been a lot of theory, I think, talked, there are a lot of ideas, I'm interested in the practical. There's a quote or saying which is, out of every adversity there comes an opportunity of equal or greater value. Yeah. For the panel, each of you, what would be that opportunity if you could click your fingers and actually help it, put it into the universe to help the economic situation? What would it be?
Great question. Thank you for that.
A question for Diane. You wrote a book, The Soulful Science. So presumably you think that economics is perceived as the science without a soul. Is there anything you would change in the curriculum of how economics is actually taught, so that at least those who are practicing economics would be able to display the soul? Thank you.
Thank you for that. That's a very good question. And there's the lady here at the front. We're doing well here with the gender balance.
Hello, I'd like to pick up on the point that Diane was making about the speed, the nanoseconds within which stock exchanges are now able to deal with information. And certainly in some of the fields I'm interested in, like the research into the ethical behaviour of companies, some of that information is now able to be updated in a much more real-time basis. So one of the things I'd like to challenge that Carol was talking about was the slow speed with which economists deal with data, 10 years on. They're telling us what was happening. I think really we've got to wake up, and I suspect that the consultant economists are actually much more aware of the fact that we live in a world where things happen now. It is actually possible to get hold of an awful lot of data in very short periods of time, and that if economics is going to survive as a credible way of thinking about things, then surely we have to be much more working in the real time and the here and now, and dealing with data that is actually available in very shortly after things have happened.
I think all I can say is I couldn't agree more that we would like to say things about current things, and we need data on which to do that. So, but the slow speed is partly to do with the British public. An example is that if you live in Norway, or Sweden, or Denmark, your health records are linked to your tax records. Your tax records are linked to your debt records. Your debt records are linked to your work records. So you can ask questions about, in real time, about people who grew up in depressions, about people whose fathers lost their jobs, what's happened to them. The British public don't want that kind of linkage. And therefore, we struggle to match, for example, data sets, and that just takes time. And I've worked in consultancy, and I've worked in government, I've worked with them all. And I know that in consultancy, what I just do is use whatever I had at hand, because I had a client who wanted an answer. I could hedge the answer. As an academic, my obligation is not to do that. My obligation is to try and really find out, A, whether it's causal, and B, really what's happening. And that just takes time, partly because I don't want to get things wrong. It doesn't matter in consultancy if I got it wrong. If the client didn't like it, they stuffed it in the back room. So I think partly the data thing is about the British public. They don't want the kind of data that allows me to do in real time what I can do with my Norwegian collaborators.
Just to that one, or not? Does anybody want to add to that response to that particular question?
On the data question?
On that data question, yeah.
I think a lot depends on the subject, and you're absolutely right in what you said, but I think it's kind of interesting how new sources of data are becoming available, and crowdsourcing of data, for example, and finding indicators that give you a better sense of where you are than the published statistics are able to do. I think there's some very interesting things happening. I was doing one seminar where I just recently stopped being chief economist for the Greater London Authority, and I wanted to have a seminar, are our data fit for purpose? So in producing a plan for London, for example. So we had two sources of employment data, which were about 500,000 different. So that's, how do you interpret any of that? But it was quite interesting how the economists would respond when we talked about, say, using telephone data, about telephone calls, all sorts of things which you can source anonymously, but which you can use to say how things are changing now. This was seen as being somehow soft data, though to me that was hard data. I might not know exactly how to interpret it, but it never changed, it never got revised, it was going to be absolutely accurate for what it was, where the rest of it moves around all over the place. So I think we need to think much more imaginatively about what we mean by data.
Thanks.
I wasn't going to talk about data, I was going to talk about the soulful science question, and I would change the curriculum, and I'm involved in a project to try and bring about some change in the curriculum. I'd take out some of the theory that undergraduates are taught, some of the macroeconomic theory, and insert instead some economic history. And when I was a student, that was a requirement all the way through to getting a PhD. And I'd insert some study of economic institutions as well, because we talk about economics now in too abstract a way, when there are institutions like sharecropping, when there are real banks, when there are real incentives in the way managers pay themselves to talk about. So those are the two big changes I'd make, and I hope it will happen before all that long.
Have we got any students out there who would like to comment on what has been suggested there? Yes, sir. Yes. Oh. Can you shout?
Yeah, I can. I really do agree with that sentiment. I'm doing my master's at the moment. I think one thing that hasn't been mentioned is the mathematisation of economics, where you have to sit and crunch numbers for years and years before you can answer any questions about before you're allowed to comment on any sort of economic processes. I just wonder what you think about. I'm also interested in graduate and PhD in terms of the breadth. We seem to always focus on a narrow discipline, and I know that a master's in economics is basically a master's in maths and not really much about the world.
I mean, how would you respond to that? Is that
I think that's perfectly fair. I think it's partly that people who like to do that kind of thing either just continue doing that thing. But I think this relates a bit to the Christmas wish list or the opportunity. And as someone who kind of did watch people wandering around like they were in the Ark, 2 by 2, I would strongly like to support cross-disciplinary work in academia, and I'd like to see more of that in both the undergraduate syllabus and in the graduate syllabus. I think some of the most exciting academic work in the world is happening in places that really kind of try and bring in people from different disciplines, particularly historians or economists. But that it isn't an easy conversation, because almost all of them have spent 10 years being trained in their discipline. Don't kid yourself that psychologists spend masses of time doing economics, or anthropologists do masses of time doing sociology. No, they don't. They do, that's the nature of academic work. It's a bit like someone once said, think of a big plane. This was a psychologist. Think of a big plane. What academics do is they're like dropped with a parachute onto that plane with a teaspoon. And they spend all their time, most of their lives, digging little small holes with those teaspoons. What we want to do is have a bigger picture and join up the teaspoon diggers for all their kind of, advantages. But that's hard. But that would be my wish list.
Thank you. Aditya, what's your wish list?
I'll embellish on that point